The late afternoon sun, a painter of long, dramatic shadows, stretched across the meticulously sculpted lawns of Harmony Creek Estates. It was a community that wore its pristine appearance, like a badge of honor, its residents navigating life by the tenets of a binder thick enough to be a sacred text of suburban order. For Mark Coleman, his wife Sarah, and their 7-year-old son, Leo, Harmony Creek had initially whispered promises of an idyllic sanctuary, a perfect canvas upon which to paint their family life. Leo, a child of bright, inquisitive spirit, navigated the world with the unique lens of autism. Routine was his anchor, the quiet predictability of their suburban enclave, a balm to his often overwhelmed senses. His hearing aids' small technological marvels were his indispensable conductors, transforming the cacophony of the world into a symphony he could understand, filtering, focusing, and bringing clarity to the soundscape around him. Their carefully constructed peace, however, found itself frequently besieged by the actions of one Agnes Periwinkle, a cornerstone, or perhaps more accurately, a gargoyle of the Homeowners Association Board. Agnes, a woman whose chronological age remained a neighborhood mystery, but whose demeanor was perpetually locked in a state of stern 60-something disapproval, had unilaterally appointed herself the supreme arbiter of Harmony Creek's extensive and often unwritten code of conduct. She patrolled the neighborhood with the proprietary vigilance of a feudal lord, her gaze missing no blade of grass out of place, no slightly too loud laugh, her tongue ever ready to dispense neighborly concern that felt more like acid-tipped darts. Behind cupped hands and exasperated sighs, residents often referred to her as the Periwinkle Blight, a title she would have likely, in her own twisted perception, worn as a testament to her unwavering diligence. Agnes's own property 2 houses down from the Colemans was a testament to her obsession. A garden so unnervingly symmetrical, so devoid of natural spontaneity, it seemed less grown and more laser-etched into the earth, a silent, constant judgment upon any neighboring yard that dared exhibit a wildflower or a playful imperfection. This particular Saturday had unfurled with a deceptive loveliness, the kind of day that tugged families outdoors into its warm embrace. Mark and Sarah, yielding to its charm, had orchestrated an impromptu barbecue in their backyard. The rich, smoky aroma of grilling burgers danced with the sweet perfume of freshly mown grass, a quintessential suburban perfume. Leo was utterly in his element. He darted and weaved a small comet of joy, chasing butterflies that painted fleeting strokes of color above Sarah's burgeoning flower beds. His delighted squeals and happy melodic hums were the perfect uninhibited soundtrack to the golden afternoon. He wore his favorite cobalt blue t-shirt, and his hearing aids, tiny lifelines to a comprehensible world, were nestled securely, as they always were. "He's just radiating happiness today, isn't he?" Sarah observed her voice soft with affection as she passed Mark a platter laden with burger buns. Mark's heart swelled a familiar warmth, spreading through his chest. "He really is. I think that new adjustment to his sensory integration therapy is clicking, and Dr. Ramirez was spot on about the new settings for his aids." Sarah beamed. "It's like watching a flower unfurl in fast motion. Every little bit of progress feels like a miracle." Their tranquil domestic tableau, however, was a fragile bubble poised on the edge of a needle. From her kitchen window, Agnes Periwinkle had been observing the Colemans' backyard festivities, her lips compressing into a razor-thin line of escalating disapproval. The sounds drifting from the Colemans' yard, particularly Leo's unrestrained vocalizations of pure, unadulterated joy, had in her meticulously kept internal ledger of neighborhood decorum flagrantly crossed an invisible, yet to her profoundly significant threshold of permissible auditory levels. It was in her view an affront to the very fabric of Harmony Creek. She emerged from her house not like a neighbor, but like a storm front marching with a rigid, unwavering stride that brooked no argument. Her floral dress, a riot of aggressive pastels, seemed a bizarre contradiction to the tempest brewing in her narrowed eyes. She eschewed the sidewalk, a public concession she rarely made, and instead carved a direct path across her own immaculate lawn, then with breathtaking entitlement across the intervening neighbor's equally manicured turf. This shortcut was less about efficiency and more a blatant declaration of her perceived dominion over the entire neighborhood. Sarah spotted her first, her own smile faltering, as if a switch had been flipped. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she murmured, a cloud passing over her sunny disposition. "Brace yourself. The periwinkle blight is on the move." Mark let out a sigh that carried the weight of countless similar encounters. "Okay, deep breaths, honey. Politeness is our shield. I'll try and run interference." Agnes arrived at their low picket fence, not deigning to use the gate, her presence radiating a chilling disapproval. "Sarah, Mark." She began, her voice possessing an edge that could have sharpened knives, each word deliberately enunciated. "I find myself compelled to have a word about the rather excessive level of noise emanating from your property." Mark stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between Agnes and his family, wiping his hands on a napkin with a forced casualness. "Agnes, good afternoon. Just a family barbecue, you know how it is. Leo's just, well, he's having a blast. Excitement is one thing, Mr. Coleman." Agnes retorted her gaze, flicking towards Leo, with an expression that could curdle milk. Leo, acutely sensitive to emotional shifts in his environment, had ceased his butterfly pursuit. He now stood frozen, his small face a canvas of burgeoning uncertainty, looking from his parents to the stern-faced woman whose aura screamed hostility. "But this constant high-pitched vocalization is frankly disruptive. This is a peaceful community, Mr. Coleman. Some of us, you see, deeply value tranquility." Her emphasis on value was a subtle yet unmistakable accusation. Sarah's protective instincts flared, her spine straightening. "He's not shrieking, Agnes. He's playing. He's a child expressing joy. There's a difference." "A child?" Agnes snapped back, her voice gaining a dangerous tremor. "Who evidently needs to be taught the fundamental concept of consideration for others, and those contraptions he wears. Jerome." She gestured dismissively towards Leo's ears. "Are they even functional, or are they merely cosmetic? He seems, if anything, louder and more uncontrolled than ever. Perhaps they amplify the wrong things." Her tone was a vile blend of feigned concern and outright accusation. Before Mark or Sarah could formulate a response, before the full implication of her venomous words could land, Agnes committed the unthinkable. With a speed that belied her stiff posture, she reached over the low fence. Her hand, bony and claw-like, darted out towards Leo, who, drawn by the rising tension in the adult voices, had innocently edged a little closer. In a single swift, unconscionably cruel motion, Agnes Periwinkle plucked the hearing aids from Leo's ears. "Hey!" Mark roared, a primal sound of paternal fury, lunging towards the fence. But the attack had been too sudden, too precise. He was a fraction of a second too late. "Agnes, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" Sarah shrieked, her voice a cocktail of disbelief, horror, and rapidly escalating rage. Leo abruptly plunged into a disorienting, terrifying vortex of muffled, distorted sound, let out a wail that was pure, unadulterated distress. His small hands flew to his ears, his face contorting in a grimace of confusion, pain, and profound fear. The vibrant, familiar sounds of his backyard, the cheerful chirping of sparrows, the comforting murmur of his parents' voices, the reassuring sizzle of burgers on the grill, all collapsed into a muted, chaotic, and menacing jumble. It was the auditory equivalent of being hurled into a deep, dark ocean, without warning, without the ability to swim. Panic seized him. Agnes, cupping the small, delicate hearing aids in her palm, regarded them with an expression of profound disdain, as if they were vermin she had just trapped. "Perhaps," she declared, her voice ringing with an chilling self-righteousness that ignored Leo's terrified cries, "a temporary cessation of this artificial amplification will encourage a modicum of natural quietness. Sometimes children need to experience the world unfiltered to appreciate silence." "Give those back to me, Agnes. Right now." Mark's voice was a low, dangerous growl, a promise of imminent retribution. He was already moving his hand on the latch of the gate, his mind racing. But Agnes, emboldened by her audacity, was not to be swayed from her self-appointed crusade for peace. Her sharp eyes, like those of a predatory bird, scanned the Coleman's backyard, searching, and then they landed on the small, portable fire pit Mark had set up earlier. It was no longer blazing, but a bed of intensely glowing embers remained from the wood he'd burned down in preparation for marshmallow roasting later that evening. With a flick of her wrist, a gesture of casual, contemptuous dismissal, as if she were disposing of a particularly offensive piece of litter, Agnes Periwinkle tossed Leo's hearing aids directly into the heart of the dying, yet still fiercely hot fire. "There," she announced, a grim, chilling satisfaction etched onto her features. "Problem solved. We can all finally enjoy some genuine peace and quiet." For a long, suspended moment, an abyss of stunned silence enveloped the backyard, broken only by Leo's increasingly desperate, heartbroken cries. Sarah, moving as if in a nightmare, rushed to Leo, scooping him into her arms. She held him tight, trying to shield him from the horror, her face a mask of white-hot, unadulterated rage, directed squarely at Agnes. Mark froze mid-stride, his brain struggling to process the sheer, calculated malice of the act. The hearing aids, Leo's lifeline, his bridge to a world he struggled so hard to understand, his connection, his clarity, his comfort, now sizzling, melting, contorting amongst the glowing embers, delicate plastic and intricate, irreplaceable wiring succumbing to the destructive heat. He could almost smell the acrid tang of their demise. Agnes, seemingly oblivious or perhaps reveling in the enormity of the devastation she had wrought, turned with an air of finality, preparing to depart. "I trust," she stated, her voice chillingly cool, as if she had merely completed a routine, if slightly unpleasant, gardening task, "that we will not be revisiting this particular issue of noise disturbance again." That was the precise moment. Something inside Mark Coleman, something primal and fiercely protective, snapped. The incandescent fury of a father, witnessing an unforgivable assault on his child, merged instantaneously with the cold, methodical, analytical mind forged by his profession. He wasn't just Mark Coleman, loving husband and father. He was Captain Mark Coleman, led Arson and Explosives Investigator for the City Fire Department. He dealt with the aftermath of destruction by fire daily. He understood malicious intent, the devastating ripple effects of reckless and deliberate acts of pyromania. What Agnes Periwinkle had just done in her breathtaking sociopathic arrogance was not merely a cruel act of extreme neighborly bullying. It was a felony, and it was happening on his watch. He moved with a speed and precision that would have surprised anyone who only knew him as the quiet, friendly dad from down the street. He intercepted Agnes before she could take more than 2 steps towards her escape route. He didn't lay a hand on her, not yet, but his sudden imposing presence was an immovable, unyielding wall of controlled fury. "Agnes Periwinkle," he said, his voice utterly devoid of its earlier forced neighborliness. It was flat official, and carried a sub-zero chill that seemed to lower the ambient temperature of the sunny backyard. "You are not going anywhere." Agnes, for the first time, blinked. A flicker of genuine surprise, perhaps even a nascent unease, crossed her usually unflappable granite-like demeanor. "Excuse me, I am returning to my home, Mr. Coleman, where I fully intend to enjoy the remainder of my afternoon in the peace and quiet I have just secured." She attempted a dismissive sniff, but it lacked its usual conviction. "No, Agnes, you're not." Mark stated, his eyes like chips of ice. "What you just did was not securing peace and quiet. You willfully and maliciously destroyed highly specialized, custom-fitted medical equipment. Those hearing aids, Agnes, cost upwards of $6,000. More importantly, far more importantly, they are absolutely essential for my son's well-being, his safety, and his fundamental ability to process the world around him, and to function." Sarah, still cradling a sobbing, terrified Leo, looked at Mark, a silent question, a dawning understanding in her tear-filled eyes. Leo was pulling frantically at his own ears, his face flushed crimson, his cries raw, guttural, and utterly heartbreaking. The world without his aids was a terrifying alien landscape of garbled noise and frightening silence. "And," Mark continued, his unwavering gaze locking onto Agnes's, pinning her like an insect under a microscope, "you didn't just break them, you threw them into a live fire pit. That, Agnes, constitutes felony destruction of property. Given the nature of that property, its critical medical necessity for a child with a documented disability, it elevates the offense significantly. Furthermore, your direct actions have inflicted extreme emotional distress upon my son and have recklessly endangered him by catastrophically impairing his ability to perceive his surroundings and respond to auditory cues, including warnings of danger." Agnes scoffed, a pathetic attempt to regain her earlier bluster, though her voice now held a distinct tremor. "Oh, don't be so overtly dramatic, Mark. They're just glorified earplugs. Your son is far, far too noisy. Someone had to teach him, and by extension you, a lesson in community standards. The HOA, I'll remind you, has stringent rules about noise pollution." "Yes. The HOA does not have rules, stringent or otherwise, that permit assault battery theft and the felonious destruction of private essential medical property." Mark countered, his voice dropping to a level that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "And I'm not just being dramatic, Agnes. I am Captain Mark Coleman, lead arson and explosives investigator for the City Fire Department." He let the title hang in the air, heavy and irrefutable. A tiny, almost imperceptible tremor ran through Agnes Periwinkle. Her eyes for the first time widened with something that looked suspiciously like fear. The carefully constructed facade of the righteous community enforcer was beginning to crack, revealing the petty, cruel tyrant beneath. This was not the mild-mannered, easily intimidated neighbor she had so contemptuously dismissed and decided to bully. You're... what?" She stammered, the arrogance momentarily deserting her, leaving her looking suddenly older, smaller, and rather pathetic. "You heard me correctly, Agnes." Mark affirmed, his tone unyielding. And as a sworn peace officer witnessing a felony in progress, which includes the malicious destruction of property exceeding a statutory value, and believe me, these custom medical devices far, far exceed that threshold, not to mention the inherent reckless endangerment of introducing combustible materials into an active fire and the targeted malicious victimization of a disabled child, I am placing you under arrest." Agnes's face, which had paled to a sickly gray, now flushed a mottled, furious red. "Under arrest? You can't arrest me. This is preposterous, outrageous. I am a respected member of this community. I serve on the HOA board. I have rights." Her voice rose to a shrill, desperate pitch. "Your position on the HOA board, Agnes, does not grant you immunity from criminal charges," Mark stated calmly, though his eyes blazed. He was already pulling out his phone. "And yes, you have rights. You have the right to remain silent. I'm calling this in. Local PD will be here shortly to transport you. But the initial report, the one detailing the felony destruction of critical medical property via fire, the aggravated circumstances, the reckless endangerment that report, Agnes, will be mine. And I assure you, it will be thorough." He dialed 911, his voice, a paradigm of calm professionalism, as he requested immediate police presence at his address. He identified himself by rank and department, stated he was off duty, but had witnessed, and was effecting a citizen's arrest for felonies committed in his presence. He clearly and concisely detailed the crime's felony destruction of property, specifically medical assistive devices, and reckless endangerment, specifying the method involved fire. He made sure to emphasize the victim was a minor with a disability. Sarah watched her initial shock now overlaid with a fierce, almost awestruck pride. She tightened her protective hold on Leo, murmuring soothing words into his hair, though her eyes, blazing with a cold fire of their own, never left Agnes. Agnes Periwinkle, the neighborhood scourge, now looked less like a self-righteous enforcer and more like a cornered, venomous animal realizing the trap had snapped shut. "You will regret this, Mark Coleman." Agnes hissed, her composure shattering into shards of impotent fury. "I have connections. Powerful connections. I will sue you for harassment, for false arrest, for defamation. I'll own your house. You'll see. Save your threats for your attorney, Agnes." Mark said, his voice like steel as he ended the call. "The primary evidence of your crime is literally still smoldering in that fire pit. My son's profound distress, a direct and foreseeable consequence of your deliberate actions, is evident to anyone with eyes and a shred of human decency." He gestured with his chin towards Leo, whose heartbreaking sobs were now subsiding into ragged, hiccuping gasps, his small body trembling uncontrollably in Sarah's arms. He kept reaching for his ears, a gesture of profound, ingrained loss. The escalating commotion, Agnes's initial strident pronouncements, Leo's piercing cries of terror, and now Mark's authoritative, commanding tone, had not gone unnoticed. Faces began to appear. Other neighbors, drawn by the undeniable drama unfolding in the usually placid Coleman backyard, were beginning to peer over fences, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. A few emerged cautiously onto their porches or stepped out onto their driveways. The spectacle of Agnes Periwinkle, the self-appointed queen of Harmony Creek, the undisputed matriarch of petty regulations, being confronted, controlled, and seemingly on the verge of actual arrest, was a once-in-a-lifetime event. Mark noted with a grim sort of satisfaction that while some faces showed shock, several others wore expressions of poorly concealed, long-simmering satisfaction. The Periwinkle blight was, it seemed, about to face a reckoning. The minutes stretched taut and heavy with unspoken tension. Sarah focused entirely on Leo, rocking him gently, trying to explain in simple, calming terms that Mommy and Daddy were there, that they would fix this, that he was safe, though her own heart hammered against her ribs. Mark stood his ground, a silent, unwavering sentinel, ensuring Agnes did not attempt to flee further, escalate the situation, or, heaven forbid, try to tamper with the evidence in the fire pit. Agnes, for her part, oscillated wildly between indignant, sputtering tirades about her rights, her community standing, her impeccable record as an HOA board member, and a sullen, venomous silence. Her eyes darting repeatedly towards the fire pit, as if willing the charred remains of her crime to simply dematerialize. But the acrid, unmistakable smell of melting plastic and burning electronics hung in the air, a pungent, undeniable testament to her malicious actions. A few neighbors grew bolder, inching closer, their whispers carrying on the afternoon breeze. "Did you see what she did? Threw something in their fire. Looked like. Were those the little boy's ear things? Coleman looks furious. Never seen him like that." One neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, from across the street, who had had her own run-ins with Agnes over the precise shade of her mailbox, caught Mark's eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of support. Then the distant but approaching wail of a siren sliced through the tense atmosphere. It grew louder, closer, culminating in the arrival of the first police cruiser, its emergency lights painting strobing, urgent patterns of red and blue across the meticulously manicured lawns and the stunned faces of the onlookers. A palpable hush fell over the impromptu audience. Two uniformed officers, their expressions neutral but intensely observant, exited their vehicle and approached the Coleman's property. "Officer Miller," Mark said, recognizing the senior of the two from previous professional interactions. He offered a curt nod. "Captain Coleman, City Fire, Arson and Explosives Division. This is my residence. This woman," he gestured clearly towards a now visibly trembling Agnes. "Agnes Periwinkle, my neighbor, moments ago deliberately and maliciously destroyed my autistic son's hearing aids by snatching them from his person and throwing them into that active fire pit." He pointed directly at the offending pit. "The approximate replacement value of these custom-fitted medical devices is $6,000. They are critical, essential medical equipment for his condition. She perpetrated this act by her own admission in response to my son making normal childhood sounds while playing in his own fenced backyard." Officer Miller, a seasoned policeman with a no-nonsense demeanor, listened intently, his sharp gaze shifting from Mark to a now startlingly pale and shaken Agnes, then to Sarah, who was trying to comfort a still distressed Leo, and finally to the fire pit, where a faint wisp of acrid smoke still curled upwards. His partner, a younger officer named Davies, began speaking quietly and gently to Sarah, taking her statement, his notebook already open. "She admitted to this Captain Coleman," Miller asked Mark, his voice professional and devoid of judgment, but with an underlying seriousness. "She characterized her actions as solving the problem of my son being too noisy," Mark replied, his voice hard. "She also explicitly stated she was teaching him a lesson. There was clear demonstrable intent to destroy. No accident, no misunderstanding." Agnes, galvanized by the presence of what she perhaps perceived as a more sympathetic authority, began to protest, her voice regaining some of its former shrillness. "This is a gross misunderstanding, a complete exaggeration. He's twisting everything. I simply removed a source of persistent grating disturbance. It is my sworn duty as an HOA board member to ensure the peace and tranquility of this community. I was upholding the bylaws." Officer Miller turned his full attention to her, his expression unreadable but radiating authority. "Ma'am, your perceived duties as an HOA board member, however you interpret them, do not under any circumstances extend to assault, theft of private property, or the destruction of that property, especially when it concerns essential medical devices belonging to a disabled child. Nor does it grant you the legal right to physically take such items from a minor. Captain Coleman, given his direct witnessing of the event and his professional expertise in matters involving fire and malicious destruction, is well within his legal rights and frankly fulfilling his responsibilities." He then turned to his partner. "Officer Davies, have you obtained the victim's mother's initial statement?" Officer Davies nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, Sergeant. Her account is entirely consistent with Captain Coleman's. The child is clearly traumatized, and Mrs. Coleman confirms the hearing aids were snatched directly from him and then thrown into the fire by Ms. Periwinkle." Miller's gaze returned to Agnes, and this time it was cold. "Agnes Periwinkle, based on the testimony of Captain Coleman, the corroborating statement from Mrs. Coleman, the visible distress of the child, and the physical evidence present, you are under arrest for felony destruction of property, specifically a medical assistive device, and reckless endangerment. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you by the court. Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you?" Agnes stared, her mouth agape, her face a battleground of raw disbelief, impotent fury, and a rapidly dawning, terrifying fear. The entire neighborhood, it seemed, every curious eye was fixed upon her. Her carefully constructed reign of petty tyranny, Her iron-fisted rule over Harmony Creek was visibly publicly and humiliatingly crumbling around her. I understand," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper, all fight draining out of her. Officer Davies stepped forward and gently but firmly handcuffed Agnes Periwinkle behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of the restraints seemed to echo through the previously quiet afternoon, a definitive full stop to her reign. As she was escorted head bowed towards the waiting police car, a few neighbors actually emerged more fully from their homes, their expressions a complex tapestry of shock, pity, and for many an undeniable, profound relief. The Periwinkle blight, the terror of Harmony Creek, was finally decisively being held accountable, not for an overgrown lawn or a misplaced trash can, but for an act of genuine, unambiguous malice, an act that had crossed a sacred line from merely bothersome to truly egregious. Sarah, her own composure remarkably intact despite the ordeal, brought a now quieter Leo over to Mark. The little boy was calmer, the storm of his initial terror having passed, but his eyes were wide, haunted, and he kept touching his ears, a poignant, repetitive gesture that spoke volumes of his profound discomfort, his loss, his disorientation. "Daddy he asked, his small voice wobbly, uncertain, yet filled with a child's unwavering faith in his father. Mark knelt, his own heart aching with a fierce protective love for his son, the earlier professional coldness melting away to reveal the raw emotion beneath. "Yes, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Daddy will absolutely fix it. We'll get you brand new hearing aids, even better ones than before. And that mean lady, she won't be bothering you or anyone else in this neighborhood anymore. I promise you that." He glanced towards the fire pit. The embers had mostly died down now, but the charred, misshapen, melted remains of Leo's precious hearing aids were still visible amongst the ashes. A grotesque symbol of Agnes Periwinkle's senseless cruelty, but also now a critical, undeniable piece of physical evidence in the case Captain Mark Coleman would meticulously help build against her. He also remembered with a fresh stab of pain something else about those aids. They weren't just functional. Sarah had programmed a tiny, loving goodnight message from both of them that Leo liked to listen to if he woke in the night. That, too, was now ash. As the police car with Agnes Periwinkle silent and diminished in the back seat pulled away from the curb, its lights now extinguished, a strange, unfamiliar quiet settled over Harmony Creek estates. It wasn't the enforced, anxious, resentful quiet that Agnes Periwinkle had always demanded, a quiet born of intimidation. It was a different kind of quiet one, tinged with the lingering shock of the afternoon's events, but also undeniably with a nascent, burgeoning sense of justice, and for many of the onlookers, a profound, almost giddy sense of liberation. Mark knew with the certainty of his professional experience that this was merely the beginning of a long and arduous process. There would be formal statements, evidence processing, legal proceedings, depositions, and very likely a full trial. Agnes, he had no doubt, would fight it. She would hire expensive, aggressive lawyers. They would attempt to paint her as the victim, a misunderstood community servant, perhaps even try to insinuate mental incompetence or diminish her culpability. But Mark had the evidence, physical testimonial and circumstantial. He had the eyewitness accounts. He had his own professional standing and detailed report. He had seen countless times the devastating damage fire could wreak, not just to structures, but to lives, to futures. And what Agnes had done in her arrogance and malice setting fire to his son's vital connection to the world. Destroying a part of his childhood was an act of profound personal and criminal destruction. He was uniquely qualified and fiercely motivated to see punished to the fullest extent of the law. He also recalled a case from early in his career, a disturbed individual who had set fire to a disabled person's specialized van out of sheer spite. The memory long dormant now fueled his resolve with a fresh layer of personal commitment. This wasn't just about Leo. It was about a pattern of behavior he found utterly intolerable. In the days and weeks that followed the atmosphere in Harmony Creek, estates underwent a subtle but palpable transformation. Neighbors who had previously scurried indoors or offered curt, nervous nods when Agnes Periwinkle hove into view now stopped to chat openly with Mark and Sarah. They offered words of genuine support, shared cups of coffee over fences, and perhaps most tellingly, began to share their own previously suppressed stories of Agnes's myriad overreaches, her petty tyrannies, her constant grinding campaign of intimidation. It quickly became apparent that the Colemans were not her only targets, merely the ones who had unfortunately suffered her most brazen and destructive act. The HOA board, deeply embarrassed by the public scandal and facing mounting pressure from outraged residents, moved swiftly to distance themselves from Agnes, initiating formal proceedings to remove her from her position and to review the very bylaws she had so gleefully and selectively enforced. Mark, true to his word and his nature, focused his energies on two fronts: Leo's well-being and the impending legal battle. They expedited an order for new state-of-the-art hearing aids, the best available. The cost was substantial, a painful reminder of Agnes's maliciousness, but Mark was already in communication with victim support services and his insurance company, meticulously documenting every expense. He also channeled his professional expertise into preparing for the case. He took detailed, high-resolution photographs of the destroyed aids before they were collected as evidence. He secured the receipts for their replacement. He obtained a comprehensive report from Leo's audiologist, Dr. Ramirez, detailing not only the technical specifications and cost of the devices, but also their absolute necessity for Leo's auditory processing, his speech development, his safety, and his overall cognitive and emotional well-being. He carefully compiled a list of neighbors who, now feeling safe to speak out, were willing to provide testimony about Agnes's long-standing pattern of aggressive, harassing behavior, particularly her unsettling obsession with noise and her thinly veiled animosity towards children playing in the neighborhood. The detail about Leo's recorded message was noted, adding a poignant layer to the cruelty. The legal process, as Mark had anticipated, was indeed arduous and fraught with frustration. Agnes Periwinkle, having posted bail, hired a formidable, notoriously aggressive defense attorney, a man known for his courtroom theatrics and his ability to twist narratives. They tried every trick in the legal playbook. They argued diminished capacity, citing the enormous stress of her HOA responsibilities. They attempted to claim it was all a tragic accident, that she had merely intended to confiscate the hearing aids temporarily for safekeeping, and that the fire pit was an unfortunate, unforeseen coincidence, a claim that flew in the face of her own self-satisfied pronouncements at the scene. They launched a desperate, deeply offensive attempt to slander Mark, suggesting he had overreacted, had abused his professional position as an arson investigator to unfairly target a well-meaning, if somewhat eccentric, community volunteer. They even hinted that Leo's autism made him an unreliable subject in terms of the perceived noise. But Mark, supported by a determined prosecutor from the district attorney's office, who had taken a particular interest in the vulnerability of the victim, remained calm, methodical, and unshakable. He presented his evidence with clarity and precision. The physical evidence itself was irrefutable. The charred, melted remnants of the hearing aids, painstakingly analyzed in the county crime lab, told their own silent, damning story of deliberate destruction by fire. Sarah's testimony was compelling, delivered with a quiet dignity and emotional honesty that resonated deeply with the jury. She recounted the events of that afternoon, her voice trembling only when she described Leo's terror and confusion, and the irreplaceable loss of the little messages they'd recorded for him. Even a few other neighbors, emboldened by Agnes's significantly diminished stature and the collective support of the community came forward to testify, painting a consistent picture of her long-standing campaign of intimidation, her unreasonable demands, and her specific, often loudly voiced animosity towards children playing and making any sound she deemed unnecessary. The most powerful and heart-wrenching moment in the trial, however, came indirectly through the testimony of Leo's child psychologist, Dr. Evans. While Leo, due to his age and vulnerability, did not testify in person, Dr. Evans provided a comprehensive and deeply moving report detailing the profound psychological trauma he had experienced as a direct result of Agnes's actions. She described the recurring nightmares that plagued his sleep, the acute fear and disorientation he suffered during the incident, the significant regression in his social interactions, and the pervasive anxiety that now surfaced whenever he saw someone resembling Agnes or heard unexpected loud or angry voices. Dr. Evans patiently and clearly explained to the court how utterly critical the hearing aids were, not just for the mechanical act of hearing, but for Leo's emotional regulation, his ability to process sensory input, his capacity to navigate complex social situations, and his overall neurological and psychological development. She emphasized that Agnes's act was not just property destruction. It was an assault on Leo's very ability to engage with and feel safe in his world. The detail about the destroyed personal messages added a layer of calculated cruelty that visibly affected the jury. The prosecution also subtly wove in Mark's past experience, allowing him to state, when questioned about his immediate assessment of the situation, that he had previously investigated cases where fire was used as a tool of intimidation or destruction against vulnerable individuals, which informed his swift and decisive actions. It wasn't a major point, but it added weight to his credibility and the seriousness with which he viewed Agnes's crime from the outset. Agnes's defense tried to introduce their own twist, a psychologist who testified that Agnes suffered from a severe undiagnosed hyperacusis, extreme sensitivity to sound exacerbated by a childhood trauma where a sibling's constant noise allegedly contributed to a family crisis. While this was intended to garner sympathy or suggest diminished responsibility, the prosecution effectively cross-examined, pointing out that a personal sensitivity, however genuine, could never justify assault and felony destruction of property, especially targeting a disabled child. If anything, the prosecutor argued, it should have made her more empathetic, not less. The revelation, however, did add a tragic, if unsettling, layer to Agnes's character, painting her not just as a monster, but as a deeply damaged individual whose pain had twisted into malice. The jury deliberated for less than a full day. The foreman, a stoic woman with kind eyes, delivered the verdict with solemn clarity, guilty on all counts. Felony destruction of property, with an enhancement for targeting a disabled individual and destroying a medical assistive device, and misdemeanor reckless endangerment. A ripple of relieved sighs and quiet murmurs went through the public gallery, where several Harmony Creek residents, including Mrs. Henderson, sat in solidarity with the Colemans. At the sentencing hearing a few weeks later, the judge, a respected jurist known for her fairness, but also her stern demeanor when faced with egregious acts, fixed Agnes Periwinkle with a piercing gaze. "Ms. Periwinkle." She began, her voice resonating with quiet authority through the hushed courtroom. "Your actions on that Saturday afternoon were not as your defense has attempted to portray those of a concerned citizen or a merely overzealous HOA board member. They were malicious, they were targeted, and they displayed a shocking, profound lack of empathy, compassion, and basic human understanding for the needs and vulnerabilities of a disabled child. You arrogated unto yourself the roles of judge, jury, and punisher, and in doing so you terrorized a little boy and willfully, callously destroyed vital equipment necessary not just for his hearing, but for his quality of life, his development, and his sense of security in his own home. This community, indeed any civilized community, cannot and will not tolerate such predatory and destructive behavior. Agnes Periwinkle, who had maintained a veneer of defiant indignation throughout the trial, a brittle shield of self-righteousness finally seemed to crumble. Her face, already pale, became ashen. Her carefully constructed arrogance dissolved, replaced by the dawning stark and terrifying realization of her predicament. The courtroom, the judgment, the uniformed bailiff standing nearby. It was all horrifyingly real. The judge continued, her voice unwavering. Therefore, for the charge of felony destruction of property with the associated enhancements, I sentence you to 2 years in state prison. However, considering the psychological reports presented by both the defense and the prosecution, hinting at underlying personal issues, but not excusing your criminal conduct, 1 year of that sentence will be suspended contingent upon your successful completion of intensive anger management counseling, participation in restorative justice programs, and the completion of 500 hours of mandatory community service, specifically to be served with organizations that support individuals with disabilities. Though given the nature of your crime, you will be prohibited from any direct interaction with children. A collective gasp, quickly suppressed, went through the courtroom. Actual prison time. It was more than many had expected. Furthermore, the judge went on, her gaze unyielding. For the charge of reckless endangerment, you are sentenced to 6 months in county jail to be served concurrently with the state prison sentence. You will also be required to pay full and complete restitution to the Coleman family for the total replacement cost of the hearing aids, any and all associated medical or therapy costs incurred for their son as a result of this incident, both past and future, and an additional punitive fine of $10,000, which will be directed to a local reputable autism support charity nominated by the Coleman family. The court will not hesitate to garnish your assets to ensure these financial obligations are met in full and in a timely manner. This court intends to send an unequivocal message, Ms. Periwinkle. Such entitled, aggressive, vindictive, and destructive behavior carries severe life-altering consequences. Mark reached for Sarah's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. He felt a profound, almost overwhelming sense of relief. Not of triumph, not of vengeance, but of justice finally painstakingly served. It had never been about revenge for him. It had always been about accountability. It was about ensuring that no other family, no other vulnerable child would have to endure what Leo had been forced to endure at the hands of this woman. Agnes Periwinkle, her face a mask of utter desolation, was quietly led away by the bailiff. No longer the formidable Periwinkle blight of Harmony Creek, but a convicted felon, her future irrevocably altered by one afternoon of unchecked malice. Her meticulously maintained house, her symbol of order and control, was eventually sold to cover her substantial legal fees and the court-ordered restitution and fines. The HOA board, thoroughly chastened and humbled by the entire sordid affair, undertook a comprehensive review and rewriting of many of their more ambiguous, easily abused bylaws, shifting their focus slowly and sometimes awkwardly from punitive enforcement to genuine community building and mutual respect. For the Colemans, life gradually, painstakingly, returned to a new kind of normal. Leo, equipped with his new, even more advanced hearing aids, which now also included a feature allowing Mark and Sarah to remotely locate them if misplaced, a small comfort. Slowly but surely regained his confidence and his joyous spirit. He still loved chasing butterflies in their backyard, his happy melodic hums and occasional squeals of delight, once again filling their home, and their hearts no longer a source of anxiety and fear, but a cherished celebration of his resilient, beautiful spirit. The neighborhood, freed from Agnes's oppressive, ever-watchful oversight, seemed to collectively exhale. It wasn't an overnight transformation into utopia. Old habits of cautiousness died hard, and the gossip about the Agnes incident lingered for months. But block parties, once rare and stilted affairs, became slightly more frequent, a little more relaxed. Children played a little more freely in their yards, their laughter a little less hushed. A genuine sense of harmony, not the artificial fear-based kind Agnes had tried to impose through tyranny, began to tentatively cautiously blossom in Harmony Creek Estates. The community was still learning how to navigate disagreements with more empathy and less judgment, but the change had begun. Mark often found himself watching his son, a quiet observer of Leo's interactions with the world, marveling at his resilience, his capacity for joy, all facilitated by the marvels of technology and buffered by the unwavering, unconditional love of his family. He knew the invisible scars of that awful afternoon might linger perhaps for a long time. But he also knew with a father's deep certainty that Leo was strong, adaptable, and deeply loved. And Mark himself had learned a profound, if unwelcome, lesson about the deceptive tranquility of quiet suburban streets. Sometimes the greatest, most insidious threats to peace and well-being don't come from some external, easily identifiable danger, but from the festering arrogance, the unaddressed pain, and the insidious intolerance lurking within a neighbor's heart. And sometimes being a good father, a good man, meant also being the unyielding, unwavering arm of the law, even in your own backyard, ensuring that justice, like the clear, crisp sound now flowing through his son's new hearing aids, came through loud, clear, and unequivocally. The fire pit remained in their backyard, but it was now used exclusively for happy family occasions, for roasting marshmallows under starlit summer skies, for sharing stories and laughter, a deliberate reclamation of a space once tainted by malice. It served as a quiet reminder that fire in the right context could also bring warmth, light, and togetherness, once the bitter ashes of cruelty and intolerance had been well and truly swept away. The end of Agnes Periwinkle's reign was a stark cautionary tale, but it also unexpectedly became a catalyst for genuine positive change, proving that even in the most meticulously regulated communities, true lasting harmony is born not from control and judgment, but from compassion, understanding, and the courage to stand up for what is right.